that constructor taking no argument is the default one. In fact, we had seen other classes or one other class where we had different type of constructor. What are we talking about? Which class are we talking about? A class and different constructor, yes. Yeah, the candlestick class, no question mark, to be honest. Okay? The candlestick class, if you go to candlestick, for instance here, candlestick.cs, you'll notice that here's my candlestick class, and when we scroll down, we say, hey, here's a constructor. Notice this is the default constructor, as the comment stipulates, and it's default because you're not specifying anything. There's no argument, okay? That's one. However, we also created another constructor. If you remember, that was the following constructor. Let's make it visible here, and let's just make it a little bit smaller so we can see the whole thing at least for the moment. Okay, and this constructor, notice, how do we know? It's got the same name as the class. It returns, there's no return type. You see that, you know, this is a constructor, meaning this is the function or one of the functions that allows me to create an object of type candlestick, because somehow you have to be able to create an object of type candlestick. The default one, we had explained what happened. For instance here, do you agree that it seems to do nothing? But what really happens with this constructor that does nothing? Well, it does nothing, but before you get into this constructor, all of the members must already exist, okay? What are the members of the candlestick class? Can someone name me the members of it?
Date, open.
Yeah, they, exactly. Those are the members. And here's the thing. Before you enter the constructor code, so before you enter here, or if you call this particular constructor before you enter here, you see how, for instance, here we're setting the date to this argument. Do you see that? That means that the date member must exist. Otherwise, you could not assign to it. Okay? Yes? No? And if it must exist, it must have a value. What is the value of date when you first come in? And you don't have to think about it just here, but when you enter this constructor, what is the value of date? Excuse me? No, it's not going to be no, because it is not a reference type. Well, it's a reference type, but what's going to happen, it will have been created with its own default constructor. Remember that the way constructors work is that before you actually enter the constructor here, all the member variables, so the date, the open, the high, the low, the close volume, must exist. It must have been established, okay? And so, well, how do they get established? Where their constructor gets called, okay? Their default constructor gets called. So you would say, well, what's the default constructor for a date? Well, it is something that sets the date to January 1st of the year 1, that is 111. Okay? Just like if you have a decimal, what's the default value when they get constructed? 0, which kind of makes sense. I mean, you could have made it anything you want, but what's more of a standard value than setting it to 0? Okay? And any kind of, if we had had a string in there, it would be set up with its default value, and that would be an empty string. Okay? So, here, if you just create a candlestick, the constructor does nothing, and all of the member variables would have been set to whatever their default values are. Okay? And we can always check that with a quick piece of code that we can debug and say, hey, let me create a new candlestick and see what the values are if I just call the default value. There was another constructor we created. This is one where you say, hey, a candlestick means you have a date, open, high, low, close volume. Why don't I make a constructor where I can pass it all this information? That's what this constructor is for. It says you can say new candlestick, and then you can tell it what you want the date, the open, the high, the low, the close, and the volume are to be. That's why this constructor looks like this. Spam. Does anybody notice a lot more spam these last few days? What's going on? Okay, so you can see how here, what we do, we say candlestick, and we set the date, the open, the high, the low, the close, and the volume based on what was passed to us, okay? Now, interview question. Is there something that looks kind of odd or wasteful in the way things are done? I call this constructor, when I say that I'm gonna set the date to this argument, but what was date already set to? Remember, the date had to be already set, and what did we say was used to create that initial value of date?
Date time.
Yeah, the default date constructor, okay? So now you say, so when I get into this constructor, date, open, high, or close, all of these would be created and would have been set equal to their default values. And then I come along and I overwrite all those default values with the values that I want here. Crappy. Particularly, again, the way that these get set up is through an invocation of their default constructor. What if their default constructors are expensive in terms of calculations and all? What if, for instance, to get the date, it says, oh, we're gonna make the default date today's date. And the way we're gonna get that, we're gonna get it from a special server that gives us the date to the trillionth of a second from an atomic clock. It could take a while. It's expensive. You're reaching through the internet just to set this guy to its default value. And after you spend all this energy and CPU time, you just set it to this value. That's why there is a syntax that allows you, when you invoke a constructor, to specify right off the bat what you want these guys to be set to without first setting them to their default value. I'm gonna go to the detail. This is like, kind of interesting, kind of interview question. Maybe I'll go look it up and read about it. Something called initialization list. Take note of initialization list with constructors, then you can see how constructor can be, there's a syntax to say, hey, this is what I want this to be set up as.